When you think about what sport could be considered the toughest sport in the world, you might have thought about football, boxing, or basketball, etc. These sports are indeed very tough, but there is a sport out there that requires more technique, more sacrifice, and more focus, which is wrestling. Now, some people don't know too much about wrestling because it isn't as popular as football or basketball, but to know the benefits and effects wrestling can do to a person is extraordinary. I'm able to speak about wrestling because I've been a part of the sport for over 6 years, and it's something I'm very passionate about. I've also coached youth groups and high schoolers from ages ranging from 5 to 18, and my brother is also associated with wrestling. Wrestling is one of the most dominant sports throughout all sports, and not only should athletes know about this, but everybody else should be informed as well. Firstly, I will explain the history behind wrestling. Secondly, I will talk about what wrestling really is and the hard work that is done from wrestling. Then finally, I will explain the long-term effects wrestling can do to a person who's experienced the sport. First, let's talk about how wrestling became a sport. No sport in our history is older than wrestling. Wrestling has been a part of our history since 3000 BCE and is involved throughout many cultures. Wrestling has been around since the first Olympic Games as well. There are many types of wrestling like belt and jacket, loose styles, freestyle, and more. There has been many changes throughout the history of wrestling, including the rules and uniforms. Wrestling was also a part of the Babylonia and Egypt work of art since 2000 BCE, as long as the Sumerian census traces of time say that they developed wrestling. India and the Chinese were more favorable for loose wrestling with dates from 1500 BCE. Also, the ancient Greeks, on the other hand, was the most passionate about wrestling ever since the first Olympics from 70 to 76 BCE. Also, ancient Greeks used wrestling as training for their soldiers for hand-to-hand combat. I've just briefly explained the history behind wrestling, but let's talk about what wrestling is and how hard the sport is. Wrestling requires so much athleticism because the sport is a hand-to-hand combat sport. The training and hard work behind wrestling really determines the outcome of every match. To start wrestling, it all begins on how much the athlete weighs. Wrestling puts you up against opponents that weigh your weight, and that is where weight cutting comes into play. Lifting and training also is a big part of wrestling because being strong and having great technique can put you in a huge advantage against an opponent. When a match begins in wrestling, you have to know that you're all there by yourself with no team and everything is on you to win that match. Moving on to the strict diet. A strict diet goes with the wrestlers they have to go through because it is important and tough because it's what makes their weight make them stronger in the next match. It's very mentally challenging to push yourself in training when you're cutting weight at the same time because you're normally training and practicing in a room that is over like 100 degrees. Another side work for wrestlers, they have to work out 5 days in a week, and it is also a requirement to become a good wrestler. So I've just talked about the hard work wrestling contains, but I'll tell you about how habits from wrestling stay with the person. Wrestling can mature a person because of the boundaries they have to cross when they are a part of wrestling. It also disciplines yourself when discipline is needed in life. Wrestling can mature a person in many ways. It stays with you when the right thing is to do and when to not. You then develop the control of your emotions in good and bad situations. Attitude and the willing to learn all comes into play when you are in a sport like wrestling. Also, wrestling not only keeps a person disciplined, but it also keeps a person in the right mind mentally and physically. So I've just informed you about every aspect about wrestling, so now let's conclude. I first told you the history of wrestling and why the sport is so tough, and also why it sticks with the person throughout their life. Wrestling is a sport that has been around for decades now, and there are many reasons for that, and it is a sport everyone should acknowledge because of the influence it portrays. A quote that I go by from professional wrestler Dan Gable: "Gold medals aren't really made out of gold, they are made of sweat, determination, and a hand to find alloy called guts."